The clock on the wall showed 9:47 p.m. when Professor Vincent Chen slammed his briefcase shut with more force than necessary. His jaw was tight, and anyone who knew him could see the frustration written all over his face. He'd just finished another exhausting lecture session with his graduate students at Riverside University, and frankly, he was disappointed. Actually, disappointed didn't even cover it. He was irritated, maybe even angry. These were supposed to be the best and brightest math students in the country. They'd fought their way through countless exams, survived brutal competition, and somehow earned spots in one of the most prestigious mathematics programs in the nation. And yet here they were, staring blankly at a calculus problem that Vincent considered moderately challenging at best. Not impossible, not even that difficult if you really understood the fundamentals. Just a solid intermediate-level problem in multivariable optimization, but they'd fumbled through it. Every single one of them. Oh, they'd tried, sure. They'd filled pages with equations and drawn diagrams and thrown around fancy terminology, but when it came down to actually solving it, nothing. Just confusion and half-formed ideas that went nowhere. Vincent grabbed his coat from the back of his chair and headed toward the door. 23 years he'd been teaching at this university. 23 years of watching eager young minds either rise to the challenge or crumble under pressure. Lately, it felt like he was seeing more of the latter. Maybe standards were slipping. Maybe students these days were too focused on grades and credentials instead of actually understanding the beauty of mathematics. Or maybe, just maybe, he was getting old and bitter. That thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. As he walked down the dimly lit hallway of the mathematics building, his footsteps echoed off the walls. The building was mostly empty at this hour. Just the way he liked it, actually. During the day, these halls were crowded with chattering students, ringing phones, and constant interruptions. But at night, peace. Quiet. Just him and the eternal truths of numbers and equations. He stopped at the large blackboard mounted on the hallway wall. It was one of those old-fashioned touches that the university had kept from decades past. Most professors use smartboards and PowerPoint presentations now, but this blackboard remained a reminder of simpler times. Sometimes students used it to work through problems between classes. Sometimes professors left challenging questions on it, turning it into an informal community bulletin board for mathematical puzzles. Vincent pulled out a piece of chalk from his pocket. He always carried chalk. Call it an old habit or maybe a superstition. But having chalk nearby made him feel connected to his work in a way that digital tools never could. Without really thinking about it, he started writing. Not the problem from class, that one was too simple, apparently, even though his students couldn't solve it. No, he wanted something harder, something that would make anyone who passed by stop and think. His hand moved across the board, writing out a complex problem involving partial differential equations, boundary conditions, and nonlinear constraints. It was the kind of problem that required not just knowledge but creativity. The kind that separated people who memorized formulas from people who truly understood mathematics. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at it with satisfaction. Maybe if they spent less time on their phones and more time actually thinking, he muttered to himself, someone around here might actually solve something challenging. As he walked away, he called back over his shoulder to the empty hallway. Even the cleaning crew probably thinks harder than those students. It was a mean thing to say. He knew that. But frustration had a way of bringing out the worst in people. And Vincent was definitely frustrated. Tonight, what Vincent didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his careless comment was about to become more ironic than he could possibly imagine. Elena. Rodriguez heard the professor's footsteps fade away as she emerged from the supply closet where she'd been restocking cleaning materials. She'd worked as a night custodian at Riverside University for almost 6 years now. 6 years of mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and wiping down desks. 6 years of being essentially invisible to the professors and students who rushed past her without a second glance. She didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. Invisibility meant peace. It meant no questions, no scrutiny, no need to explain herself or her past. She could do her work, collect her paycheck, and go home to her small apartment where her teenage daughter was probably already asleep after finishing her own homework. Elena pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway, the wheels squeaking slightly against the polished floor. She was 42 years old, though people often told her she looked younger. Maybe it was the way she tied her dark hair back in a simple ponytail, or the lack of makeup, or the utilitarian clothes she wore for work. She didn't dress to impress. She dressed to work. There was a difference. The mathematics building was always her last stop of the night. Something about it felt different from the other buildings on campus. Quieter, maybe. More thoughtful. She'd always liked math, even as a little girl growing up in a small town. Numbers made sense to her in a way that words sometimes didn't. They followed rules. They were logical. They didn't lie or change their minds or let you down. As she began wiping down the hallway, her eyes drifted to the blackboard. She always noticed what was written there. Call it curiosity or just habit, but she couldn't help herself. Usually it was homework problems or study group meeting times. Sometimes there were jokes or drawings. Once, someone had written out an entire proof of the Pythagorean theorem in 12 different ways, each more creative than the last. She'd spent her entire break that night just reading through them, smiling at the cleverness. But tonight's problem was different. Elena stopped pushing her cart and stepped closer to the board. Her eyes scanned the equations, taking in the structure of the problem. Partial differential equations. She recognized them immediately, even though it had been years since she'd worked with anything this complex. The boundary conditions were tricky, and the non-linear constraints added an extra layer of difficulty. This wasn't a homework problem. This was something else. A challenge, maybe. Or just someone showing off she should keep working. She should wipe down the board, or at least move on to the next hallway. Her supervisor was strict about staying on schedule, and she couldn't afford any complaints. She needed this job. Needed the health insurance it provided, needed the steady paycheck that kept food on the table and paid her daughter's school fees. But Elena couldn't quite tear her eyes away from that problem. Something about it tugged at a part of her brain that had been dormant for a very long time, a part that remembered late nights in a different university, in a different country, in what felt like a different lifetime, a part that remembered the thrill of wrestling with a difficult problem until suddenly, like magic, everything clicked into place and the solution appeared like sunlight breaking through clouds. She glanced down the hallway. Empty. She looked at her watch. She had a few minutes before she needed to move on to the next section. Just a few minutes. Surely it wouldn't hurt to just look at the problem for a moment. Not to solve it, she probably couldn't anyway, not after all these years. Just to look. Just to remember what it felt like when mathematics was her whole world. Before everything changed. Elena pulled a small notepad from her cart. She always kept one there for writing down supply orders and equipment issues. She also kept a pencil, though usually she used it for more mundane purposes than mathematics. But tonight, almost without realizing what she was doing, she began sketching out the problem on her notepad. Just the first few steps, just to see if she remembered how to approach something like this. The building was silent except for the scratch of her pencil on paper and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Outside the window, she could see the campus lights twinkling in the darkness, and beyond them, the lights of the city where thousands of people were living their lives unaware that in this quiet hallway, something unexpected was beginning to unfold. Elena told herself she'd only spend 5 minutes looking at the problem. Then 10 minutes. Then she stopped checking her watch altogether. Her pencil moved across the notepad with increasing confidence, like a pianist whose fingers remember a melody even after years away from the keyboard. The equations started making sense. More than that, they started speaking to her in a language she'd almost forgotten she knew. She tried the standard approach first, the one any graduate student would attempt. Set up the Lagrangian, find the critical points, check the boundary conditions. But something wasn't quite right. The nonlinear constraints were causing complications, making the system more difficult than it needed to be. She frowned, erased her work, and started again. What if she transformed the coordinate system first, changed perspective on the problem before diving into the calculations? Elena sketched out a quick diagram, rotating the problem space in her mind. Yes, that could work. That might actually simplify things considerably. Her heart beat a little faster. She recognized his feeling. It was the same rush she used to get as a young woman, staying up until dawn in the university library, so absorbed in her work that she forgot to eat or sleep. A cart rolling down the hallway broke her concentration. Elena quickly shoved her notepad into her pocket and grabbed her cleaning supplies, making herself look busy. Another custodian passed by. Raymond, an older man who'd worked at the university for 20 years. He nodded at her without really looking and continued on his way, whistling softly to himself. When he was gone, Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. What was she doing? She should be working, not playing around with math problems that had nothing to do with her life. She had 3 more hallways to clean, bathrooms to scrub, and trash to collect. She was being ridiculous, wasting time like a kid who'd found a shiny toy. But as she pushed her cart forward, her hand kept drifting to the pocket where she'd tucked the notepad. The problem was still there in her mind, turning over and over, refusing to be ignored. By the time she finished the next hallway, she'd worked out 2 more steps mentally. By the time she cleaned the bathroom, she'd identified the optimal transformation, and by the time she reached the trash collection, she knew she had to go back to that blackboard. It was nearly midnight when she returned. The building was completely empty now. Even the most dedicated students had gone home, and the few professors who worked late had long since left. Elena stood in front of the blackboard, her notepad in hand, looking at the problem with fresh eyes. She could solve this. She knew she could. The path was clear now, laid out in her mind like a map to a destination she hadn't visited in years but somehow still remembered. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge. This was crazy. What would people think if they knew the janitor was writing on the board? What if she got in trouble? What if someone saw? But there was no one to see. And somehow in this moment, Elena wasn't just a janitor named Elena Rodriguez who worried about her daughter's dental appointment and whether the rent check would clear. She was the person she used to be, the 21-year-old mathematics student who'd solved her first major theorem and felt like she could touch the stars. The young woman who'd been called brilliant, gifted, extraordinary. That version of herself felt very far away most days, buried under years of disappointment and compromise and the daily grind of survival. But tonight, standing in this empty hallway with chalk in her hand, she felt close to that person again. Close enough to reach out and touch. Elena began to write, slowly at first, double-checking each step, making sure her reasoning was sound. The transformation she'd identified, the simplification it allowed, the way the problem suddenly became manageable instead of overwhelming. Her handwriting was small and neat, years of writing supply orders having given her a precise touch. She worked steadily, methodically, showing every step of her reasoning. When she reached the solution, she didn't stop. Something else occurred to her, another approach entirely using a different mathematical framework. It was more elegant, more efficient, the kind of solution that made you appreciate the beauty of mathematics, the way seemingly unrelated concepts could connect in surprising ways. Her pencil flew across the board as she wrote out this second method, and then a third approach came to her. This one was less conventional, using a technique from topology that most people wouldn't think to apply to this kind of problem. But it worked. It absolutely worked, and it was perhaps the most interesting of the 3 solutions because it revealed something deeper about the structure of the problem itself. By the time she finished, the blackboard was covered in her careful handwriting. 3 complete solutions, each one different, each one valid. Elena stepped back and looked at what she'd created. Her heart was pounding. She felt more alive than she had in years. This was who she was underneath everything else. This was the part of herself she'd had to hide away and almost forget. But now what? She couldn't just leave this here. Could she? What would the professor think? What would anyone think? Panic started to replace the euphoria. Elena grabbed the eraser and began wiping away her work. Yes, this was better. Safer. She should just forget this ever happened and go back to being invisible. Except her hand stopped halfway through erasing the first solution. She stood there frozen, the eraser in her hand and half-erased equations on the board. Why was she hiding? These solutions were good. Really good. They were correct and creative, and they showed real mathematical insight. Wasn't mathematics supposed to be about sharing knowledge? About building on each other's work? About the beauty of discovery that belonged to everyone, not just people with fancy degrees and tenure? Elena lowered the eraser. Slowly, deliberately, she rewrote what she'd erased. Then she wrote one more thing at the bottom, in letters smaller than the rest. From someone who loves mathematics. She didn't sign her name. She wasn't ready for that kind of exposure, but she could leave this much, a small gift to whoever had written the original problem and maybe to herself as well. Proof that she was still in here, still capable, still the person she'd worked so hard to become before life got in the way. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Elena cleaned automatically, her mind still humming with the satisfaction of having solved something difficult. When she finally punched out at 2 a.m. and walked to the bus stop, she felt lighter than she had in months. The night air was cool against her face and the stars above seemed brighter than usual. On the bus ride home, she pulled out her notepad and looked at the rough work she'd done earlier. Part of her wanted to tear it out and throw it away. Evidence of a foolish moment, a temporary lapse into a past that wasn't hers anymore. But she couldn't quite bring herself to destroy it. Instead, she tucked the notepad carefully into her bag. When she got home, her daughter Isabella was indeed asleep, just as Elena had expected. At 15, Isabella was a good kid, responsible, hard-working, with dreams of becoming a doctor someday. Elena crept into her daughter's room and watched her sleep for a moment, feeling a familiar mixture of love and regret. Isabella deserved everything, every opportunity, every chance at success. That's why Elena had made the choices she'd made, sacrificed what she'd sacrificed. She'd never told Isabella about her past, about the scholarship to the prestigious university back home, about her master's degree completed at 19, about the PhD program she'd been accepted into with full funding, about the professor who'd called her work exceptional and predicted a brilliant career in mathematics. What was the point? That was ancient history, buried under the weight of the present. Elena got ready for bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept returning to that blackboard, to the elegant curves of the equations, to the satisfaction of finding not just one solution, but three. She wondered what would happen when someone saw what she'd written. Would they even care? Would they think it was just vandalism? Or would they recognize the work for what it was? She told herself it didn't matter. Tomorrow night she'd go back to work, and the blackboard would probably be erased and life would continue exactly as it had before. This was just a momentary detour, a brief visit to a part of herself she'd locked away. Nothing more. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Elena couldn't quite convince herself that was true. Something had shifted tonight. Some door had opened just a crack, letting in a sliver of light from the life she might have lived, the person she might have been. And even though she was afraid of what might happen if that door opened wider, part of her, the part that had solved those equations with such joy, desperately wanted to see what was on the other side. 3 floors below her apartment, a university professor named Vincent Chen was also having trouble sleeping, though for very different reasons. He was thinking about his disappointing students, about declining standards, about whether he was wasting his time trying to teach people who didn't really want to learn. He had no idea that in a few hours, when he returned to his department, he would find something on that hallway blackboard that would challenge every assumption he'd ever made about intelligence, talent, and who deserved to be called a mathematician. Professor Vincent Chen arrived at the mathematics building earlier than usual the next morning. He'd had his coffee, reviewed his lecture notes, and was prepared for another day of trying to push knowledge into the minds of students who seemed increasingly uninterested in receiving it. His mood hadn't improved much from the night before. If anything, a restless night's sleep had made him crankier. He was halfway down the hallway, mentally rehearsing his opening remarks for the day's lecture, when he noticed something odd. The blackboard, the one where he'd written that challenging problem last night, was covered in writing. His first reaction was annoyance. Had someone defaced it, left some stupid joke or message? But as he got closer, his irritation transformed into confusion, and then into something he couldn't quite name. The problem he'd written was still there, but now it was surrounded by solutions. Not just one solution, but 3 completely different approaches, each one worked out in meticulous detail. Vincent stopped dead in his tracks and stared. His briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a thud that echoed down the empty hallway. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the equations. The first solution used a coordinate transformation he hadn't considered. Elegant and efficient, it simplified the problem considerably before applying standard optimization techniques. Vincent could follow the logic perfectly. It was sound. More than sound, it was sophisticated. The second approach was even more interesting. It utilized variational methods in a way that showed deep understanding of the underlying mathematical structures. Whoever had written this wasn't just mechanically applying formulas. They were thinking creatively, seeing connections that required real insight. And the third solution? Vincent felt his pulse quicken as he read through it. This person had applied topological methods to a calculus problem, revealing properties of the solution space that Vincent himself hadn't fully considered. It was unconventional, brilliant, and showed a level of mathematical maturity that frankly exceeded what he typically saw from his graduate students. Exceeded what he saw from some of his colleagues, if he was being honest. At the bottom, in small letters, from someone who loves mathematics. Vincent stood there for a long moment, reading and rereading the solutions. His mind was racing. Who had done this? It had to be one of the visiting professors. Maybe someone from the applied mathematics department who'd been working late and decided to have some fun. Or perhaps a postdoctoral researcher who was trying to make an impression. It couldn't be a student. His students had barely been able to handle the basic version of this problem in class. He pulled out his phone and took several pictures of the blackboard, making sure to capture every detail. Then he went to his office and immediately started making calls. First to Daniel Wu, the department chair, then to Professor Helen Foster, who taught advanced topology, then to anyone else he could think of who might know something about this mysterious mathematician. By lunchtime, the mathematics department was buzzing with gossip. People kept walking by the blackboard to see it for themselves. Vincent had covered it with a protective sheet of plastic, not wanting anyone to accidentally erase it before he figured out who was responsible. He heard snippets of conversation as people passed his office. "Have you seen it? It's remarkable. 3 different solutions, each one more creative than the last. Vincent's obsessed with finding out who did it. My money's on that new visiting professor from Princeton." Vincent posted a notice on the department bulletin board and sent out an email to the entire mathematics faculty and graduate student list. The message was simple. He wanted to meet the person who had solved the problem on the hallway blackboard. He praised the work, called it exceptional, and invited the mystery mathematician to come forward. In his mind, he'd already composed the conversation he'd have with this person. He wanted to know their thinking process, wanted to understand how they'd arrived at these particular approaches, maybe even collaborate on a paper, but days passed and no one came forward. The visiting professors all denied involvement. The graduate students, after getting over their initial embarrassment that someone had so thoroughly outclassed them, swore they hadn't done it. The postdocs were equally clueless. Vincent even checked the security logs to see who'd been in the building that night. But the records only showed card access, and dozens of people had legitimate reasons to be there. Frustrated but intrigued, Vincent decided to try a different approach. If this person wanted to remain anonymous, fine, but maybe they'd respond to another challenge. He erased his plastic covering and wrote a new problem on the board, this one even more difficult than the first. It involved nonlinear dynamics and chaos theory, problems that existed at the cutting edge of current mathematical research. He included a note. "To the fellow mathematician who solved my previous problem, I'd be honored if you'd share your insights on this one as well." Vincent found himself checking the blackboard multiple times each day. Morning, afternoon, evening. He'd make excuses to walk past it, hoping to catch whoever was leaving these solutions. He even stayed late a few nights, working in his office with the door open, listening for footsteps in the hallway. But nothing happened. The blackboard remained untouched, showing only his new problem and his invitation. Meanwhile, Elena was in turmoil. She'd seen the commotion her solutions had caused. How could she not? The plastic covering, the photographs people kept taking, the excited discussions she'd overheard while emptying trash cans and cleaning desks. Part of her was thrilled. Her work had been recognized, appreciated, valued in a way she hadn't experienced in years. But a bigger part of her was terrified. What had she been thinking? She'd crossed a line, inserted herself into a world where she no longer belonged. She was the cleaning lady. She wasn't supposed to be solving advanced mathematics problems. She was supposed to be invisible, forgettable, someone people walked past without really seeing, and that's exactly how she wanted it, how she needed it. For days, Elena avoided that hallway during her shift. She asked Raymond if he could take care of the mathematics building while she handled the administrative offices. He'd agreed, probably thinking she was just tired or trying to switch things up. But then her supervisor announced they were rotating assignments, and Elena found herself scheduled for the mathematics building once again. She tried to walk past the new problem without looking at it. She really did. She told herself it was none of her business, that she'd already taken too big a risk, that she should just focus on her work and forget the whole thing. But it was like trying not to think about a song once it's stuck in your head. The problem was right there, visible from anywhere in the hallway, and her eyes kept drifting toward it no matter how hard she tried to focus elsewhere. Non-linear dynamics, chaos theory. She knew this material, had studied it intensively during her master's program. Her thesis had actually touched on related concepts, exploring the boundaries between predictable and unpredictable systems. This problem was difficult, genuinely difficult, the kind that would require hours of concentrated work. But she could see the beginnings of an approach, like a path through a dark forest that only she could perceive. Elena lasted 3 nights before her resolve crumbled. She told herself she'd just think about it, wouldn't write anything down, would keep it purely mental exercise. But thinking led to sketching a few notes on her pad. Sketching led to working through the initial stages of the problem. And working through the initial stages led to her standing in front of that blackboard at 1 a.m. with chalk in her hand. Her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This time she was even more careful. She checked the hallways multiple times, listened for any sound of footsteps or doors opening. She worked quickly, efficiently, her hand steady despite her nervousness. The solution came together like pieces of a puzzle, each step leading naturally to the next. When she finished, she stepped back and examined her work. It was good. She knew it was good. But instead of signing off with another anonymous message, Elena hesitated. The professor's note had said he wanted to meet her, wanted to understand her thinking. For just a moment, she imagined what it would be like to have a real conversation about mathematics with someone who understood it the way she did, to discuss theories and approaches without having to hide who she was or pretend to be less than she was. Then reality crashed back in. What would happen if people knew the truth? The janitor who solves advanced calculus problems, it would become a spectacle. People would either not believe her or they'd treat her like some kind of curiosity, a performing monkey doing tricks. And worse, what if it affected her job? What if the university decided she was overstepping, being inappropriate, making people uncomfortable? She couldn't risk it. She had Isabella to think about, bills to pay, a life that depended on her staying exactly where she was. Elena erased the signature she'd started to write and left the solution unsigned. Then she quickly finished her shift and hurried home, promising herself that this was absolutely, definitely, positively the last time. Professor Vincent Chen found the new solution the next morning and felt a strange mixture of elation and frustration. The work was extraordinary, showing an understanding of chaos theory that demonstrated years of study and genuine brilliance. But the lack of signature, the continued anonymity, drove him crazy. Who was this person? And why wouldn't they come forward? Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Vincent would post increasingly difficult problems, and after a few days, solutions would appear. Each one was correct, creative, and showed remarkable mathematical ability. Vincent started varying when he checked the board, hoping to catch his mysterious colleague in the act. He came in at different times, early morning, late afternoon, middle of the night. But he never saw anyone. The entire mathematics department became invested in the mystery. People started calling the anonymous problem solver the phantom mathematician. Some professors thought it was a brilliant publicity stunt. Others suspected it was someone from another university playing an elaborate game. A few of the more paranoid faculty members thought it might be a sophisticated AI, though Vincent dismissed that idea immediately. The solutions showed too much creativity, too much human insight. Meanwhile, Elena was living a double life that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. By day, or rather by night during her shifts, she was Elena Rodriguez, quiet custodian who kept her head down and did her work. But in the hours between seeing a new problem and writing her solution, she was someone else entirely. She was the mathematician she'd trained to become, the scholar she'd worked so hard to be. She started spending her free time at the public library, reviewing advanced mathematics texts, making sure her knowledge was current. She filled notebooks with practice problems and theoretical explorations, hiding them in her closet where Isabella wouldn't accidentally find them. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. But she also felt like she was being pulled in 2 directions, stretched between who she was and who she'd had to become. The tension couldn't last forever. Something had to give. And Vincent Chen, frustrated by months of anonymous exchanges, was about to take matters into his own hands. Vincent Chen had reached his breaking point. 3 months of anonymous solutions. 3 months of increasingly complex mathematical exchanges with someone who refused to reveal themselves. It was maddening. He'd tried everything: notices, emails, even offering a small research grant to anyone who could solve the next problem. Nothing worked. The phantom mathematician remained just that, a phantom. So Vincent decided to do something he probably should have thought through more carefully. He was going to stake out the building. He'd stay all night if he had to, hidden in his office with a clear view of the hallway blackboard. Sooner or later, his mysterious correspondent would show up, and when they did, Vincent would finally get his answers. He told his wife he was working late on a research paper. Not exactly a lie, but not exactly the truth either. He brought coffee, snacks, and a comfortable cushion for his office chair. He positioned his desk lamp so he could read by it without being visible from the hallway. Then he cracked his door open just enough to have a clear line of sight to the blackboard and settled in to wait. The building slowly emptied as evening turned to night. Vincent heard professors leaving, calling out goodbyes to each other. He heard the sounds of doors locking, computers shutting down, the general exodus of the academic day coming to a close. By 9 o'clock, the building was mostly quiet. By 10, it was silent except for the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Vincent tried to stay focused, but his mind wandered. He answered emails, reviewed his lecture notes for the next day, even started outlining a paper he'd been meaning to write. Around 11, he heard the sound of wheels squeaking in the hallway. The janitorial staff making their rounds. He barely paid attention, just part of the background noise of the building at night. But then the squeaking stopped, right in front of the blackboard. Vincent's attention snapped back to the present. He quietly moved closer to his door, peering through the crack with sudden intensity. A woman stood in front of the blackboard. The janitor, he realized, though he'd never really looked at her before. She was just one of the cleaning staff, part of the invisible workforce that kept the building running. He could see her cart parked nearby, cleaning supplies visible. She was looking at the blackboard. Vincent waited for her to start wiping it clean or spraying it with cleaning solution. But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the problem he'd written earlier that day. Probably confused by all the mathematical notation, Vincent thought. Maybe wondering if she should erase it or leave it alone. But then she did something that made Vincent's breath catch in his throat. She reached into her cart, pulled out a small notepad, and began writing. Not randomly, not like someone doodling. She was working through the problem. Her pencil moved with purpose, pausing occasionally as she thought, then continuing with what looked like growing confidence. Vincent felt like he was watching something impossible. The janitor was solving his problem. No, that couldn't be right. She must be copying something, or maybe just making notes about cleaning schedules that coincidentally looked like mathematical notation. But as he watched, she moved closer to the blackboard and picked up a piece of chalk. And then she began to write. He recognized the style immediately. The neat small handwriting. The methodical way she showed each step. The creative approach to the problem that characterized all the previous solutions. Vincent stood frozen in his office doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The phantom mathematician wasn't a visiting professor or a secretive graduate student. It was the cleaning lady. The woman he'd walked past dozens of times without really seeing her, without even wondering if she had a name or a story or a life beyond pushing that cleaning cart. Vincent stepped out of his office. The sound of his door opening made Elena spin around, her eyes wide with panic. The chalk fell from her hand and clattered on the floor. For a frozen moment, they just stared at each other across the hallway. "You?" Vincent said, and he hated how much disbelief was in his voice. "You're the one who's been solving these problems?" Elena took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for her cart as if it could somehow protect her. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I'll clean it off right now." "Wait," Vincent said, but his tone was all wrong. It came out sharp, accusatory. "How are you doing this? Where are you getting the solutions?" Elena's face went pale. I just... She fumbled with her words, clearly terrified. "I worked them out myself. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have touched the board. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." You work them out yourself, Vincent repeated, his skepticism clear in his voice. These are graduate-level problems. Advanced graduate level. Some of them are research-level questions. And you're telling me you just figured them out while cleaning? The way he said it, the sheer impossibility he implied, made something shift in Elena's expression. The fear was still there, but now there was something else too. A spark of anger maybe, or wounded pride. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now. I figured them out. I know you don't believe me, but it's the truth. Vincent crossed his arms, still struggling with what he was witnessing. How? Where did you learn this level of mathematics? Did you study it somewhere? I have a master's degree in mathematics, Elena said quietly. From the National Autonomous University. I was working on my PhD before I had to stop. A master's degree, Vincent said, and there was still that note of doubt in his voice. He couldn't help it. It didn't make sense. Why would someone with a graduate degree in mathematics be working as a janitor? From where, when? Elena's hands clenched at her sides. 15 years ago, in my home country before I came here. I was 21 when I finished my master's. I had a research fellowship and everything. She paused, then added with a bitter edge, not that you have any reason to believe me. Vincent's mind was reeling. If what she was saying was true, then this woman had been a genuine mathematical talent. But then why was she here pushing a cleaning cart at midnight? It didn't add up. Unless she was making it all up. Unless she had somehow gotten access to solution keys or was working with someone else who fed her the answers. Okay, Vincent said, his voice taking on a challenging tone. If you really solved all these problems yourself, then solve one for me now. No notes, no time to prepare. Just you and a problem. Elena looked at him, and Vincent saw the hurt in her eyes at his obvious disbelief. But she nodded. All right. Vincent walked to the blackboard, erased a section, and wrote out a problem. He chose something from complex analysis, a field that required deep understanding and couldn't be faked. It was the kind of problem he might give as a final exam question to his best students, and even they would struggle with it under time pressure. Solve this, he said, stepping back. Show me how you'd approach it. Elena stared at the problem for a long moment. Vincent could see her breathing was unsteady, could see how nervous she was. Good. A small, uncharitable part of him thought, if she's been fooling everyone, let's see her squirm. But another part of him, a part he was trying to ignore, hoped she could actually do it. Hoped that something remarkable and unexpected was happening right in front of him. Elena picked up the chalk. Her hand trembled slightly as she started to write. The first thing to notice, she said, her voice quiet but steady, is that this function has a singularity at z equals I. We need to determine what kind of singularity it is. Removable, pole, or essential. Vincent watched as she wrote out the Laurent series expansion. Her approach was methodical and correct. She explained each step as she went, not just mechanically applying formulas, but showing real understanding of what the mathematics meant. We can see from the Laurent series that the principal part has only finitely many terms, Elena continued, writing out the residue calculation. This means it's a pole of order 2. So to evaluate the contour integral, we need to apply the residue theorem. She worked steadily, showing the calculating ion of the residue, the selection of an appropriate contour, and the final evaluation of the integral. When she finished, she stepped back from the board and turned to face Vincent. The answer is pi over 4, she said. Vincent stared at the blackboard. The solution was perfect, absolutely perfect, not just correct, but elegantly presented with clear reasoning throughout. This wasn't someone who had memorized techniques without understanding them. This was someone who deeply, truly understood mathematics. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. He'd been so skeptical, so dismissive. He'd looked at this woman and made assumptions based on her job, her appearance, the fact that she didn't fit his mental image of what a mathematician should look like, and he'd been completely, utterly wrong. I'm sorry, Vincent said, and he meant it. I shouldn't have doubted you. That was excellent work. More than excellent. Elena didn't say anything. She just stood there holding the chalk, looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Vincent realized she was still afraid. Afraid of losing her job, probably. Afraid of what would happen now that her secret was out. Please, Vincent said, his voice softer now. Don't apologize. You haven't done anything wrong. I'm the one who should apologize. I made assumptions, stupid, prejudiced assumptions, and I'm sorry for that. He paused, then asked gently, "Will you tell me your story? Help me understand how someone with your talent ended up here." Elena hesitated, clearly torn between running away and accepting this unexpected olive branch. Finally, she set down the chalk and in a voice that shook slightly, began to speak. "My name is Elena Rodriguez. I grew up in a small town, but I was good at math. Really good. I got a scholarship to the university in the capital, finished my undergraduate degree in 3 years, and went straight into the master's program. By the time I was 21, I'd completed my master's thesis on applications of differential geometry to dynamical systems. I was accepted into a PhD program with full funding. My advisor said I had a real future in research." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But then my mother got sick. Cancer. Someone needed to take care of her, and I was the oldest. My father had died when I was young, and my siblings were still in school. So I took a leave of absence from the PhD program. I thought it would be temporary. Just a semester, maybe a year." Vincent listened in silence as Elena continued. "But my mother needed treatment that we couldn't afford in our country. Good treatment, the kind that might actually save her life. I heard that in the United States there were better options. So I came here with her, working whatever jobs I could find to pay for her care. By the time she passed away 2 years later, my student visa had expired, and the PhD program had given my spot to someone else. I couldn't go back even if I wanted to. I eventually got my legal status sorted out," Elena said. "Met a man, got married, had a daughter. The marriage didn't last, but Isabella, my daughter, she's the best thing that ever happened to me. She's 15 now, smart as anything, wants to be a doctor, and I want to give her every opportunity I never had. So I work as a janitor because it pays enough to support us and has decent health insurance. And most of the time I don't mind. It's honest work." She looked back at the blackboard at the equations she'd written. "But sometimes I see problems like the ones you post and I can't help myself. For a few minutes I get to be the person I used to be. The person who loved mathematics more than anything. So I solved your problems. I know I shouldn't have. I know I was crossing some kind of line. But I couldn't resist." Vincent felt like someone had punched him in the chest. This woman had sacrificed everything, her career, her dreams, her future, for her family. And here she was, working night shifts and cleaning buildings while keeping this incredible gift hidden away because life hadn't given her any other choice. And he'd been ready to accuse her of cheating, to dismiss her as impossible because she didn't fit his narrow definition of what a mathematician looked like. "Elena," he said quietly, "what you did, solving these problems, you didn't cross any line. You reminded me what mathematics is really about. It's not about credentials or positions or who has the right to solve problems. It's about beauty and truth and the joy of understanding. You have a gift, a real gift, and you shouldn't have to hide it.